everyone. Welcome to our episode of AWS Connections. My name is Michael Palermo with the Developer Relations Group here. And with me, I have...
Hi, I'm Richard. I'm also with here Developer Relations. And I think Michael's going to tell you what this episode is about, but it's obviously an AWS episode. And I'm actually not much of an expert in AWS, so I guess my job is mostly to look pretty, ask Michael some questions, and maybe pass on some of the questions from chat from you.
Sounds good. And before we even get started with that, we first want to make a comment, an apology for the mishap that happened for any of you who might be joining in today that were attempting to join into our live stream yesterday. We did have a challenge, and in fact, I'm going to call upon Peter to see if he might want to chime in and just explain what happened.
I don't know exactly what happened, but there was an API problem. I think we realized with troubleshooting, but we have it sorted out for now. It's not fixed, but it's in the process. But so if any of you tried to show up to attend our Mapathon live stream, it's going to be rescheduled for next week. It's not going to be on Twitch. I'll post the link to the Mapathon if you are interested to join it. It should be in chat. And yes, it was all Ray's fault. He's in chat right now. It's Raymond Kemen. You can blame it all on him.
That's funny. Yeah, it's always good to shift blame.
So the link is in chat. They'll announce the intro webinar through that platform, but we will have a second live stream go out for the Mapathon probably in November. So follow us on Twitter to get notified when that happens. But other than that, very sorry. We did everything possible to get it to run, and I don't know why, but it just wouldn't work. And we tested everything beforehand, and it was literally the last possible fail-safe didn't work. So, but we're clear now.
Sounds good. We did have a question in the chat about what is the Mapathon, and the link that Peter provided, that's where you want to go to get the details, but highly encourage you to look at it. This is a phenomenal contest, so please take a look.
You can win a lot of money and have fun in the process, so go check it out.
Absolutely.
Yep. All right, I'm going to disappear, and your names will come back. So goodbye, everyone. I'll stay in chat. I'm here, Dev, by the way. Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. Okay, so Richard, you did mention at the beginning that you didn't have much AWS experience, but I think you said something, you're here for the good looks and so forth, which is great. I do want to let you know that you actually made an excellent profile for this episode of AWS Connections because it allows developers, experienced developers, which I know you are. I mean, you're very talented in writing code for mobile devices, for connected things, such as either whether they're like phones or tablets or even watches and things like that. So he's written some excellent code, but perhaps you haven't done much in the AWS world, which means that I'm going to have your perspective throughout this episode to perhaps chime in, provide feedback, or even comment, of course, on our own API features as we get there. So I am so happy that you're here with us today. And Richard, as he already mentioned, is going to be scanning the chat to see if there's any questions that you might have. So remember, we're live. We encourage you to absolutely interact with us via that chat mode. And even before we get into the content, Richard, I wanted to share with everyone who is watching right now how much this wild Rydes workshop, how much information you can soak in. And just to give you some perspective, here are the following services from Amazon that are covered in just 2 of their workshops. And Richard, I'm going to try to do this in alphabetical order. So are you ready?
All right.
All right. So 1, Amplify Console. That's a service that allows you to have a Git-based workflow for continuous deployment for full-stack web apps. 2, Athena. This is an interactive query service, so you can use standard SQL against a file that's not even meant to be used for standard SQL, but simplifies the querying of that kind of data. Third, we have the API gateway so that you could create custom API endpoints for underlying services.
And just to let you know, those were three things that started with A, so we're going to be here a while.
Oh, yeah. Next is Cloud9, which is the online integrated development environment, or IDE, that Amazon has provided. Next is Cognito, which is the identity and data sync management for users. Then Dynamo DB, which is a NoSQL or key value and document type of data storage. Then we have IAM, which is the identity and access management, which is another way of saying how to secure and authorize things within your applications. Then we have Kinesis. So, and that it comes in three flavors, the data streams, which is real-time data streaming. Also data firehose, which allows you to archive, transform, or essentially persist data captures from the stream. And also Kinesis data analytics, which is simplified stream processing. Now we'll get to Lambda, which is of course serverless processing. Then we have the serverless application repository, which is where you can find pre-built templates that are like functional deployments. So multiple services could be deployed at the same time. And then we have S3. Now I know you said, Richard, that you're not that familiar with Amazon, but do you know what S3 is?
Simple storage solution, something like that.
Very close. Simple storage service. So that's what S3 stands for, and that's where a lot of data gets stored. So the point for me bringing all those up is to say those two workshops that we're about to dive into, you would do all those services, and that's a lot. I mean, that is a lot of information just to even talk about at an overview, let alone to dive deep into any one of those. So here's my point in bringing this up. Richard, if you do a workshop or a tutorial of any kind, how would you describe your pace and the purpose behind doing any kind of tutorial or workshop?
Well, the point of a tutorial and workshop would be to learn, and the pace would, of course, be very, very small because of my brain.
So from my perspective, I think I can relate a little bit to what Richard said. And that is, if you were going to do these workshops, not to just fly through them just to get them done, but at a moderate pace, which also allows you to capture learning points, I would say in its entirety to do the two that are going to be the focus of our discussion today, I estimate it's about 2 hours. Therefore, that's why we're not doing these tutorials or workshops on our episode today, because they would take too long anyway. What we are going to do is walk you through some of the highlights of the tutorial and the things you should know as you go through them. And we encourage you, these are really good workshops or tutorials, and encourage you to try them out. So with that said, I would say let's go ahead and dive into our demo mode and get a little bit more specific about what we mean by wild rides. So what you should see on the screen right now is the wild rides we should.
We're just making fun with the disembodied voice in our heads. Or can you actually hear Peter for once? No, I'm being told you can't hear him. You've heard him earlier, so now you know what we have to put up with.
I don't understand why Richard's talking like this. I don't know. Anyway, back to me wanting to talk about the screen. The screen should say Wild Rides Serverless Workshops. The reason for that, this is, and this is important to highlight to all of our viewers, Richard, this is Amazon's workshops. We don't own them, Amazon does. So I believe I will call out to Peter to say it would probably be good to share that link at some point in the near future with all those in the chat, how to get to these workshops. But these workshops focus on various aspects to help Amazon or developers that are targeting the Amazon platform to learn a lot of those services, much like the list that I described earlier. There's, I think, 5 or 6, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, no, 7 workshops at their GitHub location for where these AWS samples are. And what I want to stress is that we're only going to be focusing on 2 of them, and that is the web application and the data processing. In addition to that, on Amazon's GitHub page, if I scroll, you'll see that under third-party workshops, they do mention the here geocoding and routing extensions. So this is going to be one of our focuses today is in addition to those workshops that you would need to complete. So let me make this clear. You would complete the web application workshop, you would complete the data processing workshop, then you are now prepared to do these extensions, which would happen after you've completed those first 2. Does that make sense, Richard?
That makes sense to me.
Okay, so what I want to get into now is to dive in a little bit as to, first of all, maybe a recap or summary of what you build without our extensions, and then focus on what happens after the extensions. Therefore, I'm going to go in a little bit of a different order, or I should say I'll go in alphabetical order. I'm going to start with data processing. And by the way, each of those workshops are autonomous from one another. So if you just wanted to do data processing or you just wanted to do web application, they're autonomous. So they're not connected to one another. So they're 2 standalones. So we're going to go into our first one here, which is data processing. I'll go ahead and open this in a new tab. And you'll see that this particular workshop has 4 modules in it. So at a high level overview, you're going to create a stream of data that is going to be captured. You're going to see it visually, but you're also going to be able to query that data. So that real-time streaming data is the actual data itself. And then, of course, there's going to be the use of all these different other services that add value to that live streaming data. Now, what I want to mention, of course, is this is all called wild rides, as we mentioned at the beginning. And a central character or feature of these workshops is a unicorn, which has been interestingly debated among all of us today, and you'll see why when we get to certain screens. But unicorns are at the focus of these wild rides. You would be essentially getting a unicorn to take you for, it's a new form of rideshare, I guess is a good way to say it. So I am going to now walk through what it would be needed for you to just even see or get a glimpse of what the final outcome is for at least just doing this module. And then I'm going to dive into some other details. So
right. In the meantime, I just want to jump in real brief. I see Silver Dark is actually subscribed with Twitch Prime, which is really, really nice. Thank you for that. And it might be a good time maybe to remind everyone that if you do subscribe to us, we actually donate all of this to a good cause. Unfortunately, I've forgotten what the good cause is, so now the disembodied voice in my head needs to remind me. CARE International. It's a relief fund. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Richard. Okay. So again, upon completing the data processing module, I just want to let you know what would happen as a result. I want you to see the results. For that, I'm going to take you over to Cloud9. Cloud9 is the IDE for developers online with Amazon. I'm going to open up a terminal window in here. And in the terminal window, I want to start a process. The process is going to start live streaming data. But before I even do that, I want you to see where that's going to have a visual impact. I'm going to open up the Unicorn dashboard, and it's going to ask me for an identity pool. Now, this has already been saved in cache for me, but part of the workshop is that you build or construct one of these to use that uniquely identifies you. So I'm going to start. And then when I do that, you'll notice there's nothing on the screen right now. I'll zoom in a little bit. You don't see anything striking other than maybe a little blue dot right here in the center. Would you confirm that that's what you see, or the voices in your head might see, Richard?
Both me and the voices in my head can confirm that this is what we're
That's
seeing.
awesome.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so now I'm going to go back over to that development environment, and I'm going to launch. This is something you build in the Wild Rydes. I'm going to launch the live streaming of data by invoking the producer, and I'm going to showcase what happens if I just invoke it on its own without any other information. Just, no flags set, no parameters. I'm going to go back over to the website, and now, as you can see, there is a unicorn, and this is where the controversy starts to kick in here, Richard, because that thing looks like it's going in a straight line over neighborhoods. But I'm just going to click on it real quick so you can see that there's also data associated with it. By default, the name is Shadowfax. And I believe that you felt that was an appropriate name for a unicorn.
It's not an appropriate name for a unicorn because, as everybody knows, Shadowfax was a horse. The Lord of Horses, a very important horse, but there's no corn, right? So Definitely very bad name for a unicorn.
Yeah. Excellent gesture you just did, by the way. Thank you. That's very good. All right. So now I'm going to go back over to this development environment. I'm going to pop up a new terminal window. And because I feel that Richard is somewhat passionate about this topic, I am going to ask him to provide me a name for another unicorn to join.
How about Sparkles?
Sparkles, said with a German accent even, like extra. I'm going to hit enter.
I'm putting in the effort here.
And now if I go back over to the dashboard, you will see that I have yet another unicorn that's showing. So the whole point of me showcasing this aspect of it is to demonstrate that the output of this data processing workshop, without any extensions, without any here interaction, is to produce something like what we're seeing on the screen now, and that is you can have multiple live feeds happening where your website is getting that data, but also important, not just your website, but the way that you capture and collect it behind the scenes is also important. So I'm gonna showcase that right now by going into the Dynamo DB. Now, part of the process of the workshop is you construct a database, and I'm going to be focusing on this unicorn sensor data, which you would build within that module. So again, this is all part of the original one. So various names from previous attempts that I've used, that's all right in here. It's providing a measure of data, about distance, about their max health points and all that, kind of like an aggregate per each one of these. Now, this is our opportunity to say, so where can you go from here? What could you add, or what's the value add? So going back over to these, or I'll click right here. So our data processing extension, and by the way, this URL is available by going to the bottom here and just clicking on this third-party workshop. So that's how I got to this page for the here extensions. Notice that what it says is this extension uses the AWS services to process real-time data streams with serverless applications. This tutorial will then augment the data stream by inserting street addresses of each unicorn in the fleet using here's Geocode API. So that is the point of this extension, is to provide even more back-end data to capture about these unicorns. So nothing would change visually on the screen, but what would actually be captured behind the scenes is what really changes. Does that make sense?
We've also just learned that a group of unicorns is apparently called a fleet.
It's a fleet of unicorns. That is correct. That's what we're going with. So I'm now going to go back over into or actually just dive right into this extension. And I want to highlight what the main areas are. So it says the first thing that you would do is you would deploy the here geocode function. Now this R extension, so now we're in our world, in our GitHub environment. You're recommended, if you're following along, to go ahead and click on this link, which would take you to, so I'm going to do that. It would take you to this page. This page allows me to deploy into my environment from the serverless application repository our geocode function. Now, if I were to click on deploy and scroll down a little bit, you'd find that all you would need to do is provide it a name and provide your here app code and here app ID from your projects area after you've initially created a profile with here. So
Michael
so
in chat earlier suggested Juniper Montage as a good name for a unicorn. Maybe we can call the app that.
Yes. Well, actually, I'm not even going to create this app because I've already done it. I just wanted to showcase what you would have to do. However, so I'll go ahead and X out of there. I'm going to go back to where we were talking about. So deploy the here geocode function. So here's what's interesting, and I want to call attention to this. So of course,
I got to make a correction. I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but it was actually Raymond and his magnificent beard who suggested Juniper Montage. It was not Michael.
Gotcha.
It's very important.
That was important. Okay. So deploying the here geocode function. So let me explain what that means. That means you're deploying a Lambda into your environment that already has the calls to our API baked in, which is great. But it also does something else, Richard. It also deploys a corresponding API to invoke that Lambda function, which made it very interesting for me when I saw this next step and it said create and deploy the API. Now, I just want to explain that. I'm just talk about it with you for a moment. Technically speaking, when this workshop was created, I'm sure the developers who initially created it thought how cool it is that we can have our here API already packaged up into a Lambda. And so you don't have to use a blueprint. You don't have to copy and paste from somewhere. It's already baked in, already uses environment variables for the app ID and app code. How cool. But what they probably didn't realize at the time is that we already created the API. You don't need to technically do step 2 because it's already been done. Now, granted, if you're following along with this extension and follow it, letter by letter, it's still going to work. But I'm just calling out one of the advantages to deploying the geocode function is that you wouldn't have to do step 2. So any thoughts or comments on that?
Well, I guess it's always nice if you can skip steps in a workshop. On the other hand, it's also nice that it's there. So if you want to learn how to do it and gain a little bit more knowledge, it's available to you. So that's cool. But it's a good call out so you don't basically duplicate work that we've already done for you.
That's correct. Having said that, if you were to say, well, I'll skip step 2, I don't need to do it, you still would need to make sure that things are wired up correctly. So in that case, I'm going to dive right into the API gateway that was already created for the geocode. So I'm going to go to the WildRide Geocode API. And the first thing I want to highlight here, Richard, is that by default, it created what's called a path parameter called search text. And if I click on the get here, which would allow me to do a test, I'm not going to do the test, but I'm going to click on the link over here, which allows me to see what does it invoke at the end. And I want it to take me to the corresponding Lambda. This Lambda is going to be the Lambda function that was created when we deployed from the serverless application repository. And the code that I want to highlight, so I'm just going to scroll this up a little bit. First thing that I want to highlight, and you could tell me this, Richard, would you consider that the default URL for Geocode?
No, because that is the reverse geocoder, right? So geocoder allows you to basically take an address and turn that into a location, a latitude and longitude, and that would be the default option. But a reverse geocoder would, well, do the reverse. In other ways, you would get a location and turn that into an address, which incidentally, I think is what we're trying to do. We want to take the location of the unicorn and we actually want to figure out what address is the unicorn currently at.
That's correct. So if you're following those instructions in that very first step when you deploy, there's instructions in there on how to change that. So that's already provided. So nothing's changed here as far as the code is concerned. However, I just wanted to also highlight this line of code. It's line 51, where it says let search text equal event.pathParameters.search text double pipeline event.queryString parameters.search text. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this, Richard, is that in the code that comes by default with when you're doing these labs, it actually uses something similar to what's on the line above it, which is like event.pathParameters.procs, or says something like queryParameters.procs. Because they created their own API, there was a different wiring up of the API to the Lambda. But as you saw in our Lambda or in our API gateway, search text is what we need to use in order to do the proper wiring up. So I just made sure that whether we get it through path parameters or whether we get it from a query string parameter, we need to get the value for search text. And this also allows, up here you'll see on the screen, there's something called test, or let me just pause that escape thing. Right up here, this test button. If I were to test this and only query strings was being looked at, it would actually fail because this is passing in path parameters. So I'm just highlighting that for anybody who might be following along. You should probably add that line of code that I just talked about, checking for either path parameters or the query string parameters. So any thoughts or questions on that?
No, makes sense to me. I think that's kind of important to know if you're going through it. So I think it's good that you're calling that out.
And then maybe you could talk a little bit about what kind of attribution are we adding to the API here from what you can see?
So basically the only things that we're adding here are obviously you see the app ID and app code, you need your credentials obviously, and then we have two parameters, one is called mode and one is called max results. Max results is super obvious. You can basically tell the API, how many results would you want. In this case, we really just want to add one address to the unicorn, so we'll just say one. That's fine. And then there's mode. The Geocoder API is actually a super powerful API with lots of interesting features in it. Retrieve addresses is kind of the standard mode for the reverse geocoder because that's usually what you want, but there's other things you can pull from it. You can pull nearby landmarks from it, and then it would be retrieve landmarks, or you could pull the administrative area around that particular location, and then it would be retrieve areas. You would get a list of these administrative areas around it, and so on. The Geocoder API even allows you to pull the shapes of those, so you could get the shape of a city or a city district or a state around the location to draw it on a map. And so there's a lot of features in there. We're not really looking at those. We're really kind of using the default, which in this case is retrieve addresses. We just want one, so we're limiting the results to one, and that's it.
Very good. Thank you. So ultimately, how this extension ends, it culminates to the following. If I go back to the Dynamo DB, we now have a new table called unicorn location. And when I look at that here, now we could see that associated with each unicorn on a minute tick, we're finding out what address they were at. So instead of just having the latitude and longitude, which was also provided here, we also have the reverse geocode of the address. So that's the culmination of that data processing module and its extension. So for the data processing folks, highly exciting stuff.
Okay, if you say so.
I say so. So now I'm going to go back over and just kind of reset ourselves to talk about the next one. So in the same kind of flavor, what I want to do is say, let me talk about what the web app workshop does at a high level overview. and then talk about what our extension does to enhance it.
Makes sense.
And I think
we're about the halfway mark of the stream, so that's about a good time to look at the second
there you go.
workshop.
So,
And the disembodied voice in my head tells me to make sure to tell you to ask questions if you have any. But seriously, that just, keep me busy, please, because Michael is the expert here and he knows everything, and I'm just here mostly to ask questions. And ideally, I would like you to ask your questions because they're probably a lot smarter than mine.
That was a very good way to explain that voice in your head. Thank you, Richard. Okay, so with regard to the web application, so I'm going to go back over to our IDE. I can now stop these processes, Control-C in each one of these tabs, Control-C. So I just stopped that live data from the data processing. I'm now switching gears. I want to get into the web application itself. So when I go over into this one and click on the workshop itself, it goes into, all the things that you would want to do in order to create a static web host with some interesting backend and user management scenarios. So instead of walking through their code and their steps, I'd like to actually show you what the product looks like that you build in this workshop. And to do that, I'll go straight into the Wild Rydes website. So there you go. Apparently also meant for pets. But it is an interesting website for the new form of rideshare. Now, part of this initial workshop that you would build with Amazon gets into how you can manage user identity and also persist data associated with each user. If I were to click on GiddyUp, what it's going to do is it's going to say, hey, do you want to register? Well, I've already registered. That's why some of my values are already pre-populated in those text boxes. I don't need to actually register again because I've already authenticated myself. So I'm going to go up to this URL and replace register with ride HTML. This is kind of the core feature of this, of what this app builds. And in this example, we're now looking at Seattle. That's technically my corporate home base. And I think where Peter may be living, at least the voice in your head might tell you that. I don't know. But I think that's somewhere in that area. So again, part of the actual base workshop without using our extensions is that if you click somewhere on the map, like I just did, and then say, hey, I'm here, I'd like to request a unicorn. I click the request unicorn button, and now lo and behold, again in a straight line.
I feel like those unicorns have wings, and I feel like that's a Pegasus, not actually a unicorn. And then, a unicorn, maybe they're unicorns with wings, but then technically they would be pegacorns. I feel like I'm getting mixed messages here, and I'm not sure they really thought this through, but okay.
Well, the reality is this. However they get there, this is how the core workshop ends. It literally just provides you this top box with information that you were able to establish that you're the one that clicked on that map and that there is a unicorn, a named unicorn coming your way to meet you there. Now I'm going to go back over to our extensions and explain what we're going to be doing differently. So again, if I were to click here on either one of these, I believe it takes us to the web application extension. So it says this module will teach you about extending your web application using serverless applications from the AWS Serverless Application Repository. Okay, so technically that's true. In other words, you're going to be adding a new feature to the web app. And I'm going to tell you what that feature is right now since it's not explicitly stated here. The extension that we're going to be adding to the web app is the ability to now bring everything to a reality according to those who are well versed in unicorn terminology. And that is, we're going to bring routing to the table. Routing. So that means they would obey street laws. They would not fly as the crow, or, in a straight line as the crow flies, but they actually would follow a map. That's the extension. So I'm going to click on that extension and show what the steps would be required to do this one. So deploy the here routing function. See, in this case, it's the same process as when I clicked the link for the geocoder in the previous. You click on this link, which I'm not going to do, takes you to the serverless application repository. You just click deploy, you add the app ID and the app code, and it generates the necessary code for your routing. What I would like to do is start with our API gateway, go over to the, where do I have the routing? Right there, routing for wild rides, and just show that once again, once this routing request comes in, it ultimately invokes whatever this Lambda is over here. So I'm going to click on the Lambda so we can take a little bit of a peek at the code.
And while you do that, I'm going to answer the question from the disembodied voice in my head, who's also magically posting in chat. The Latin word for horn is cornu, and therefore a unicorn is a unicorn and not a unihorn, even though I would agree that unihorn is a much better name.
I don't even know what to say. Okay.
Ask me something about the routing API.
Okay, so in this example, does that look like a core routing API call?
It actually does.
At least the core, it is.
Yeah.
So nothing's really getting changed there.
It's kind of the standard routing call.
Yeah. In fact, this code is very much just saying whatever you pass through in the query strings, that's what we're going to use. So there's nothing fancy about this one. There's not a lot of modifications because in this example, there wasn't a need to have a separate kind of a API to bring us here. It's all being used together. So where things get interesting is not in how this is executing, but how it gets called. So I'd like to go into the calling code. This is where the extension, through the extension that you would use with here, you would create this new code. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to cruise over there, and right now I'll make our terminal windows go away because we don't need them anymore.
No, sparkles, don't go.
Yes, gone. And I'm going to click into this file here, which is where the actual call is to that API gateway. So this is the custom API gateway call to the Lambda function we were just looking at. Mm-hmm. You'll notice at the top, beginning on line 166, and I'll just zoom into that a little bit. We have these variables that are going to get used. The first one is waypoint 0, which is pickup, but the next one's called drop. Now, what I think would be really nice to do for our viewers is to give them a visual of what this is going to mean. I'm going to now showcase what the end result is for this and then come back and talk about the code. Okay. So going back to Wild Ride, so we already did what we would say is the pickup, right? Mm-hmm. But now we need to establish, and where are you taking me to? So this is what new behavior is added by the here extension. And I'm going to say like somewhere over here is where I would like to go. So then I say set drop. And what that's going to do is provide not a straight line, no, but an actual route that the unicorn will take by land to your destination following all traffic rules. And along the way, we could ask for information like directional information. That's what all these little points along the way mean, is when you have to make a change, keep right and so forth. That's all this is. So I wanted to provide the viewers, this is what the here extension does, is it takes it from just, hey, a unicorn met me at the pickup point, and that's it. That's all that web app does. And now we've extended it with, and now you can create a destination and see the route to get there, because ultimately we understood that they would have a land, they would have to go by land. That's pretty much.
What
the
you're
reason
saying
for the
is,
extension.
unlike AWS, we understand proper unicorn anatomy here at
Yes.
Geotechnology.
Yes, but in their defense, they kind of threw in the word magic a few times, I think, to kind of cover over
This
it.
is true. I mean, technically speaking, with magic, you can walk on water through buildings and everything. And unicorns are magic, so we'll give them a pass.
Sure. All right, now I'm going to go back over to that code. So this was the call. This is what we added in order to make sure that we could extend that workshop with this additional routing data. So we made this call. Now, if I go back up and take a look at those data pieces again, the pickup is actually, when you click on the map, it's returning the geolocation or the latitude and longitude. So that's what that is. It's a JSON format of the latitude and longitude. Likewise, so that's waypoint 0, and waypoint 1, as you can guess, is where our destination is, where we want to go. The next thing is our mode. Now, it looks a little confusing. I want to ask you if you can tell me why it looks confusing.
Well, because you've probably formatted it as a URL, which you need to do at some point. So this is really just fastest, semicolon, car, semicolon, traffic. And my English is letting me down right now, so I'm going to say double dot.
It's a colon.
That's the word I was looking for.
It's a colon. Oh, double dot works, yeah. So the reason why I'm specifically showcasing this here with these escape characters for the URL is because it's imperative that if the means by which you're going to communicate with your API does not do automatic URL encoding, you're going to be responsible for doing that yourself. So of course, I could have passed this through a URL encode function, but I left it this way in order to make a point that make sure you have URL encoded your attributions, because if I replace the %3b here, I'll highlight that. If I were to replace that with what is in our documentation, which is just a semicolon, then this call will not work. So I'm just highlighting that.
Yeah, I mean, in quote unquote real development, like you said, you'd probably just format it in a more readable format and then throw it through a URL encoder. But I think it's important to highlight that so you don't run into trouble.
Absolutely. All right, so then down here, of course, all we're doing is we're just well, I'll escape out of here. We're just adding those values to that line, which is just like moving off the screen. But one of the points in here that I think is very important is at the very end, it says route attributes equals SH. And so I know you have a lot of routing experience. What does that mean, Richard, to have that SH there?
Well, one of the things we already saw in the previous screen or in the demo is that you actually ended up drawing the route on a map. And this is something that the routing API provides, but it does not provide it with the default response. And this is a super powerful API with a huge amount of features that can give you really a lot of data. And that's why there's these various attribute parameters. There's route attributes and leg attributes and maneuver attributes. Like a route consists of legs and legs consists of maneuvers and so on and so forth. And for each of these in the response, you can really, with these attributes, determine what information you want and what information you don't want. So in this case, the SH parameter stands for shape, which in turn means that for the route itself, you want all the information you get from the standard response, but in addition, you also want the shape information, which you then in turn can use to draw on a map as a polyline.
Thank you. So I'll tell you, when doing this particular workshop, the line 175 and 176 were completely changed. I am showing you a new version. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this file and make sure that on our developer, at our GitHub location where this is located, I'm going to also add another file that would be like an alternative to this one. So this one is named Ride.js. So you might see something like Ride.alternative or ridealt.js or something to that effect that says, here's an alternate way to use this particular code file, because what was here before actually was using a feature called JSON-P, and it's personally, it's not like my favorite choice for managing AJAX or these kind of back and forth calls. I don't know if you're familiar with JSON-P, but basically it's where you provide a callback method name for something to be processed. And I just
before you get too worked up about JSON-P, I'm gonna just pick up a question from chat where Michael has asked,
okay,
if I needed the unicorn to pick up my friend along the way, could I add waypoints to the route? And the answer is, of course, yes. There's a reason it's not called start waypoint and end waypoint. It's called waypoint 0 and waypoint 1. And in fact, you can add a lot of waypoints. In fact, I think there's not even a hard-coded upper limit on the waypoints you can add, so you can really add a lot of waypoints. Obviously, once you start adding 200, the response is going to come back fairly slow, but there's really no limit around the waypoints you can add.
Yeah, and from a web application perspective, to go further with the question, what you would need to do in the web app is just make sure instead of having a static start and end, you would need to add that capability to allow for, once you click on an area in the map, that you're basically adding multiple pit stops, and then have like a final, like you're done, so to indicate the destination.
And if you want to take that further, really, if you have multiple pickup, if you're doing sort of a unicorn pool type of situation, and you have multiple pickups, and you kind of need to make sure you pick people up in the right optimal order, there's another API we have, which is called the Waypoint Sequence Api, and that actually takes multiple waypoints like this, and it sort of does a traveling salesman heuristic and gives you the quote unquote optimal order in which to travel through those points. And then you can take the order of these waypoints from that API, then feed that into the routing API, and then you have unicorn pool.
Yes, in fact, just as Richard was talking, it reminded me that when you deploy our routing function into the serverless application repository, the very code he's talking about is already provided for you. So you have that waypoint sequencer right here. So it's available to use. If I'm just throwing that out as a side point, it's not part of the workshops, but it is available to use.
Peter, disembodied voice Malahan, just said in chat that our last episode of season 2 of Dev Waypoints covered that, and by that presumably he meant the Waypoint Sequence API. And that might be a good time to remember you that you can actually find all of the old episodes if you've missed them on YouTube, which is very nice.
That is true. So the only other point that I wanted to make about this code file was regarding that SH that we were talking about earlier, that shape file. If you are going to rework this file, let's say that you wanted to construct the URL on your own, as I ended up doing, if you don't have that SH, then you can't do what we do down here, and that's say add route shape to map, passing in the route data and expecting that there would be a child of that route, that JSON object called shape. There won't be one unless you explicitly request it. So that's all I wanted to highlight there. And I think that wraps up both of our extensions. I just want to say, while I'm still here on this screen, you can get to all of this from the one link that goes to this Amazon workshop page, because it's all the workshops and it also has the links to our extensions. Although I do believe that we did provide both links in the chat window. Just remember, the first one probably points to the only one you really need, which points to all of them. And with that, I could say, let's return to our studio. Okay, so Richard.
So Ray mentioned something in chat about, Ray says JSON-P was the solution you used before CORS. Ray, I just stopped Michael from ranting on about JSON-P for 5 minutes. You don't need to encourage him. So I've decided we're moving on from this.
Yes, okay. So if you want the newer way of doing things, then I will provide that file in our GitHub repository. Again, that's at our developer workshops maybe that may have already been shared already. If not, then we could post it again, but I think it's there.
I feel like I need to talk more because I haven't talked enough today. So I'm going to have another question from chat, another question from Michael. Michael doesn't have that many friends, which is sad, but I can relate. And he asks, if the unicorn can use pedestrian routes rather than car routes, can I route that way? And the answer to that is yes. So the routing API, actually, you saw earlier, we put car in as one of the parameters. And there's a lot of alternatives for this. For example, you could put in public transit, and it would give you public transit routing. So I don't know if it's legal to take your unicorn on the subway. Depends on the city, on the regulations. Like there's some cities where you can take your dog, but only if it fits in your bag or something. I don't think a unicorn fits in your bag. So I don't know how this works, but that's one option. Pedestrian is another. If you have a very fat unicorn, you could also use truck routing, right? Make sure the unicorn isn't too heavy for the bridge, that sort of thing. So for more details, you can go on our developer portal to check out the routing API, but there's a lot of routing options. There's no official unicorn routing yet. I believe this is on the backlog of the routing team, but until then, I would suggest you use cars.
Oh boy, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, good explanation of our different modes for routing. Excellent. All right. Well, Richard, you already mentioned this. If anyone is interested in seeing anything at all regarding our previous episodes, we only keep the episodes on Twitch for a limited time, and then they go over to our YouTube. So in order to find that YouTube, we also have on our developer live streams link at GitHub on our README page a link to where you can find all those past episodes. So I don't know if that has already been placed in there yet, but if it hasn't, please make sure the live streams GitHub repository is there so that everyone can see those YouTube videos if they choose to do so. Also, if you have additional questions, we encourage you to join our Slack. And also, we're on Twitter, so @HereDev, singular, HERE Dev, on Twitter is kind of our official developer relations Twitter alias. My personal one is Palermo4. And then Richard, what is yours?
Yeah, I really need to get a catchier one, don't I? Maybe I'll adopt my Suselsaurus from Twitch, but right now it's just my last name, SUESELBECK.
Okay, and I believe that some of those were already placed into our chat, which is nice. And let's also talk about what's coming up. So again, Peter mentioned this at the beginning of the call. There will likely be an episode regarding the Mapathon sometime next week. So again, stay tuned to the page that was provided earlier in the chat that has all the contest information. That will come forth there. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned. With regard to what's up with us next, we are going to have an episode for Azure Connections, our next one, on October 2nd. October 2nd, again at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And this is going to be focusing on how to use Geocode within an Azure environment. Any shameless plugs, Richard?
No, not really. Mostly, I just want to quote Michael from chat again, who said that a fat unicorn is generally called a rhinoceros.
Gotcha. So, a shameless plug I would provide. I'm going to be, if you're in the San Jose area shortly, in just a couple weeks, I will be at the API World Conference. So if you're there, stop by and say hello. If you're in Milan, Italy, later on in the month, I'll be there for Code Motion. And also going to be at the Developer Week in Austin. And that's going to be in November. And just far in the distance, I think both of us, Richard, and correct me if I'm wrong, are going to be at reInvent in December.
I think we are, yes. I've got a horribly inconvenient flight with a 12-hour layover in New York because it turns out it's very difficult to get flights to reInvent if you book late. but I'm optimistic that I'll make it.
Info our viewers need to know. Thank you.
If you haven't booked your flight to reInvent already, now might be a good time, particularly if you're coming from Europe.
All right. So
that's practical consumer advice from Here Technologies.
Yeah. And finally, we encourage you once again to follow our channel here on Twitch. Make sure that you keep up with our notifications, whether it's here or on our Twitter stream. And I think that's going to be a wrap. I want to say thanks to everyone that joined today. And thank you, Richard and Peter, for making today's episode possible.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for your questions in chat. And see you next time.